Institute. Welcome to the third day of our watershed conference, and we're on a session talking about total maximum daily loads, TMDLs. I'm going to start off with a land acknowledgement. We'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. We recognize that the land and water now under our care is the traditional and ancestral territory of the Lenape. We pay respect to the Lenape people, past, present, and future, and their continued presence in the homeland and throughout the Lenape diaspora. We respect their knowledge, culture, and traditions, which have contributed to the conservation of land and water. We also acknowledge that historic white supremacy and environmental racism practices have caused disproportionate environmental and climate impacts on people of color in overburdened communities. The Watershed Institute pledges to work for clean water and healthy environment, including in communities that have been unjustly affected by systemic racism and environmental pollution. I'd like to thank our sponsors, the Dodge Institute, who have funded our programs for a number of years, as well as this conference, Princeton Hydro, who is a sponsor of our conference, the Lake Hopatcong Foundation, and Musconetcong Watershed Association. So with that, a couple of housekeeping. We have two great speakers from outside of New Jersey, so I greatly appreciate them. We are applying for continuing legal education credits. So if you are an attorney and you need those credits, we will have two poll questions during the session. Please respond to them so I can keep track of that as part of our submission to the Supreme Court for approval. So with that, I'm going to get on to the session. We have two great speakers. Their full bio is in our packet, but I have Sean Bothwell, the Executive Director for the California CoastKeeper Alliance, the California CoastKeeper Alliance initiative to protect and enhance healthy inland and marine waters throughout the state for the benefit of Californians in the California ecosystem. And I have Evan Isaacson, the Director of Policy and Research for the Chesapeake Legal Alliance. He is also the senior attorney there. As many people know, the Chesapeake Bay TMDL has been an exciting thing on the East Coast, at least, and I've been very jealous of here in New Jersey that we don't have. So with that, and again, like I said, their bios are in our packet. We're going to have Evan start, and then Sean is going to follow up. We're going to keep most of the questions to the end, but if you do have questions, please put them in the chat, and I will ask whether you want to, ask that question live. Otherwise, I will read that at the end for the question and answer session. So with that, Evan, please take it away. And you're muted.
You'd think I'd understand Zoom by now. All right, so thank you for the introduction. I won't introduce myself or CLA any further in the interest of time. Just a few minor housekeeping things. One, I should probably just say, nothing in this presentation constitutes legal advice. It's just sort of good habit for us anytime we're talking to anybody. Secondly, there are a few acronyms and a little bit of jargon. If you have questions, please put them in the chat. I'm sure Michael can help answer them, and I will as well. Just for everybody's reference, TMDL is basically a watershed or water body cleanup plan. And an MS4 permit is simply a stormwater permit for typically a municipal government. Those are the two acronyms that I'll probably be using most. Finally, just as a disclaimer, I have spent my entire professional career in Maryland. I know enough to know that every state has completely different laws, completely different government structures, budget processes, politics, etc. So, I just want to make clear that I don't have very good advice for New Jerseyans because I don't know New Jersey all that well. So I'm simply going to be providing my perspective as an environmental law professional here in Maryland. Okay, so brief outline. We're going to talk a little bit about the Bay TMDL. I'm not going to go too deeply into that. Then I'm going to move on a little bit to how we should be thinking about, an MS4. The acronym itself and the longer term for which it stands are, it's arcane and doesn't sell itself. So let's talk a little bit about why stormwater and MS4 policy is so important. After that, I'll talk a little bit about, the law, some of the legal standards. And then finally, and most importantly, I suppose, what would we do differently in hindsight here in Maryland after 2 decades of having a sort of robust MS4 water pollution policy? What could we do different based on what we've learned? And I suppose for your sake, what could you derive from our experience? Like I said, keep the background and history very short. We have had decades of failed attempts to restore the Chesapeake Bay, typically based on a collaborative interstate model that was supposed to be upended by the Chesapeake Bay TMDL that EPA wrote in 2010. And what was supposed to happen was they were supposed to address sort of the missing ingredient prior to the Bay TMDL, which was a lack of accountability. The Bay TMDL, at least for lawyers, is synonymous with its accountability framework, with EPA supposedly taking the centerpiece as the referee to push the states to live up to the commitments that they make under the Bay TMDL in their watershed implementation plans, which is simply the strategy that each of the 7 Bay jurisdictions put forth to meet the 2025 Bay TMDL pollution reduction targets. I will stop there mostly as far as the Bay TMDL and its history. There is actually hot off the presses, the Environmental Law Institute's upcoming Environmental Forum's feature story is on the Bay TMDL's history, and it's written by our co-founder, Ridge Hall. So there's no shortage of articles that you can refer to learn more about the Bay TMDL and prior agreements to restore the Chesapeake Bay. So a couple of other interesting background notes. One is that the MS4, as far as the Clean Water Act statute is concerned, both the MS4 policy and the Chesapeake Bay have a common birthplace. The 1987 amendments to the Clean Water Act address both of those issues. But if you fast forward another decade to 15 years, that's when Maryland finally started to think about what they should be doing to update and modernize their MS4 permit in order to achieve water quality goals, the Clean Water Act, and to help restore the Chesapeake Bay. So around 2001 is when it really started. Maryland's Department of the Environment issued an MS4 permit to the largest county in Maryland, Montgomery County in the DC suburbs, with what's called the ISR standard, Impervious Surface Restoration Standard. So that standard essentially says you have X thousand acres of impervious surface, and you need to restore, I think at the time it might have been 5%, maybe 10%, that first generation of those impervious surface acres. So using stormwater best management practices, they essentially had to not physically remove impervious surfaces, but make sure that those catchments are draining to a best management practice that filters or infiltrates the stormwater. The idea here being that, after successive permit terms, they would eventually get through all of their impervious surfaces, and you would essentially have a vast urban and suburban landscape that mimics natural hydrology. So I will stop there as far as the background. I do think it's important to understand a couple of things here. One is that while the Bay TMDL was written in 2010, that impervious surface restoration policy in the MS4 permit predated it by at least a decade, right? So we can't say that, EPA wrote the TMDL and voila, all of a sudden the states all hopped to it and started putting in these bold, innovative policies. If you actually back up to the time, 2001, and the years leading up to the issuance of that permit, what's interesting is not only that there was no Bay TMDL, but that one of the drivers, I think, for that innovative and bold policy was the fact that Maryland is sort of a hotbed for stormwater science and engineering, and it long had been. Here, you can see on this slide the impervious cover model, right? An early graphical depiction of the impervious cover model, which was created by some engineers here. And I do want to highly encourage you all to check out the Chesapeake Stormwater Network and Center for Watershed Protection websites. It's a wealth of resources, and the experts there, I'm sure, will be happy to answer any questions you have. They and others have really moved the ball forward on stormwater management, the science and engineering of stormwater management nationwide. But given that they're here in our backyard, I think that really probably helped push Maryland way ahead of many other states as far as inserting water pollution control policies into our MS4 permits. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about why it's important to impose water quality protections in an MS4 permit. I'm not literally going to be talking about rebranding here. I'm not a marketing expert, but whether you say, the acronym MS4, or you spell it out and say municipal separate storm sewer system permit, it's a mouthful and it's boring. And I'm not even joking. My wife asked me to talk about stormwater when she needs help falling asleep. We need to talk not so much about what a storm sewer system is or how it's being treated under the Clean Water Act. We need to talk about the impacts of stormwater itself, right? So it's not about a sewer system. It's about the fact that what comes out of that sewer system is completely untreated discharges of pollution. The fact that the impervious surfaces that convey that stormwater lead to flash flooding. The fact that the pollutants in that stormwater are toxic and expose the surrounding communities. So I think, one of the lessons we in the Bay community have learned is that the word stormwater doesn't exactly resonate, and whether we rebrand with terms like polluted urban runoff or just think about some of the impacts of stormwater, that has actually helped catalyze focus. I would say stormwater is sort of the hot button issue as far as Bay restoration is concerned. And I'm going to talk in the next slide about why. So climate change is inextricably linked with stormwater, at least in this region. I assume New Jersey is not very different from Maryland in that fact. We have the benefit of Michael said he was jealous we have the Bay TMDL. I would say, don't be too jealous. The TMDL itself hasn't been all that successful. What has been successful and what is really important is that we have a federal appropriation every year for the Chesapeake Bay program, which is chock full of scientists, engineers, modelers, and experts on everything to do with the Chesapeake Bay. And I think in recent years that has really, meant to some degree advanced analysis of the impacts of climate change. Baltimore and Ellicott City in 2018, we saw catastrophic flooding. It made national news. The small town of Ellicott City, a historic town in central Maryland, was devastated by just a wall of water that rushed down the main street, destroying cars, and I believe it killed a few people. Those communities are still rebuilding, and importantly, they're not just rebuilding the way they were, they have received considerable state funds to sort of climate proof. Ellicott City in particular, to a lesser extent, West Baltimore, which is a policy problem I won't be talking about today, but it's important to recognize that advanced MS4 permitting is, in fact, probably one of the most important climate adaptation policies our state has. By requiring jurisdictions to do something about their vast expanse of impervious surfaces, and encouraging them to filter and infiltrate, especially infiltrate that stormwater, you're going to have less floodwaters, and that's going to become more and more important as climate change gets worse and worse. And to that end, this past summer, NOAA released their decadal climate normals database. It's not new data, it's just the National Weather Service's data, but they compile it in a way that's, they synthesize it and compile it in a way that's digestible. And one thing I immediately did was look at the annual rainfall average. That's an average, and a long-term average at that, a 30-year average or a 15-year average, depending on what you look at, for BWI Airport in Baltimore. And in a climatological blink of an eye, a decade, that annual figure of 41.1 inches jumped 15%. I mean, I couldn't believe it, and I am a bit of a climate alarmist, one might say. So I was shocked to see just how much additional rainfall we have. And obviously, you really have to drive home that connection. Rainfall equals stormwater. Environmental injustice is obviously another major issue implicated in MS4 permitting. As I mentioned earlier, unlike wastewater dischargers who, like a sewage treatment plant or a factory that discharge directly to the surface water, stormwater is discharged to a surface water via the outfalls, but before it gets there, it's conveyed through those impervious surfaces. It's essentially just washes through urban and to some extent suburban communities untreated, right? So whether you have atmospheric deposition of, metals, for example, from a coal-fired power plant, or you have brake dust and whatever comes out of a tailpipe, that's all on the streets, that's all on the sidewalks, and stormwater mixes it up and spreads it around and washes it around. So if you leave those impervious surfaces unrestored, unaddressed, unattended to, that's a health issue. And given that there are more impervious surfaces and fewer trees, as we've heard a lot about in recent months, in many of these urban, particularly lower income urban communities, becomes a very important environmental justice problem. Toxic exposure, as I mentioned, the quality of stormwater is, the more you dig, the more alarming it becomes. If you haven't already looked at the National Stormwater Quality Database, NSQD, I would highly recommend you do that. The event mean concentration for a lot of pollutants is shockingly high for stormwater monitoring results in a lot of urban areas. And you don't just have to look at an industrial stormwater site. Some of the highest figures for a lot of metals and toxins is actually in the highway systems. Those toxic pollutants, again, in an urban community are, all around the people who live there. There's been some interesting research in recent years, including from the NIH, that some of those pollutants end up, being tracked into the homes of a lot of people. And when, if they have, older adults or younger children, and especially those toxins can have an outsized impact on health. I would also point you to, I believe I mentioned already, the Chesapeake Stormwater Network. They have some great resources on their website about what is in stormwater. And I would point you to their Dirty Dozen urban toxic contaminants list. Those are some of the pollutants that, the public, policymakers, and permit writers need to be thinking about. How do we reduce exposure for urban communities, especially for those pollutants? And then finally, from a bigger picture perspective, here again, because we have the TMDL and we have these different pollutant source sector reduction goals, one thing that's become abundantly clear is as we have essentially brought all of our publicly owned wastewater treatment plants essentially to world-class technology, such that their discharges are, a tiny fraction of what secondary treatment standards are now. You squeezed about as many reductions as you can out of that wastewater sector. If you were to completely take them off the table, especially in places like Pennsylvania, but even in a more urban place like Maryland, if you were to take all of the pollution from that sector off the table, you still can't meet your TMDL goals without making additional reductions for stormwater. So there is a realization here because of the TMDL that you have to do something about stormwater. You cannot just upgrade your wastewater treatment plants and expect to restore the bay. And then, yeah, again, taking a step back, we are 50 years to the week that the U.S. Senate unanimously passed the Clean Water Act. 1971, it was the Clean Water Act of 1972, but the Senate passed it in November 1971. Here we are, half century later, and we're asking a basic question: should an MS4 permit, a point source, be trying to achieve the goals of the Clean Water Act? And I would say, from a common sense perspective, clearly, obviously, the answer is yes. We should have been all along trying to make sure that MS4 permits incorporate water quality standards, incorporate a water quality-based effluent limitation to meet those standards. From an advocacy perspective, the fact that we're having this conversation today, and I listed off all those reasons to care about stormwater, I think that suggests that we have our work cut out for us to raise awareness among policymakers and the public. And as a segue, I'm going to talk a little bit about the law here. It's tricky. So here's another acronym you have to know if you're going to understand MS4 policy and the law. The MEP standard, maximum extent practicable. So in the 1987 amendments, when they addressed MS4s, they had one standard for industrial facilities, right? And they basically said, industrial facilities, you're part of the Clean Water Act fully, and you have to meet water quality standards eventually. MS4s, they held out separately. So here is the entirety of that provision, and I'm actually going to read it. So permits for discharges from municipal storm sewers shall require controls to reduce the discharge of pollutants to the maximum extent practicable. There's that MEP standard, including management practices, control techniques, and system design and engineering methods, and such other provisions as the administrator or the state determines appropriate for control of such pollutants. Okay, so that's what the law says, and here's where it gets really weird or confusing. After some judicial review and some challenges around the country, including in California, including here in Maryland, one interpretation of that provision, that very important provision, and I'll talk about why it's so important in a minute. One interpretation is this. MEP essentially governs everything that comes after. So shall require controls to reduce pollutants to the maximum extent practicable, including 1, management practices, 2, control techniques, blah, 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 and 3, such other provisions. So this important provision here is subject to essentially the MEP standard. That's the legal ceiling. And under this interpretation, a permitting authority really has no right to include anything other than what is part of the maximum extent practicable level of effort. So that's one interpretation that those representing municipalities who don't want to have to do anything bold and aggressive, that's their interpretation. The second interpretation is this. MEP basically is 1, management practices, 2, control techniques, and 3, system design and engineering methods. I should point out in both of these, I changed punctuation just for emphasis. These are not the original. The original is back here. So MEP controls this language, and then full stop, semicolon, and such other provisions. So the point here is this: MEP limits what a permitting authority can do, but it only includes those things. Then they also have the discretion, if they so choose, to include such other provisions as is determined appropriate for the control of such pollutants, right? So that is a more lenient standard that says they have the discretion, that a permitting authority has the discretion, if they so choose, to go beyond the maximum extent practicable. There are entire journal articles about those commas and about that provision. There are numerous cases, as I mentioned, including 2 in California and 1 here in Maryland. There's actually been several here in Maryland. This is the most recent one. And yes, there are plenty of lawyers that are trying to figure this out. The bottom line, and I'll end my legal discussion here, is could one compel, let's say an environmental group, could they compel a permitting authority in a state to write an MS4 permit that strictly complies with water quality standards? You know, I can't give a definitive answer and I wouldn't want to try, but based on the limited precedent, based on the arguments that I've seen to date, the answer is probably not. I certainly wouldn't have a lot of confidence in that. MEP acts as a legal ceiling, so you can't compel a state to go beyond MEP. But as we mentioned, does a permitting authority have discretion to write an MS4 permit that incorporates a waste load allocation or otherwise tries to deal with the water pollution impacts from stormwater? Yes, I think that's what the majority of the case law says. Now, I hope there are smarter lawyers than me who do challenge some permitting authorities to think about implementing the Clean Water Act. And there may very well be some courts who come out to a different conclusion than the one so far. All right, so finally, we'll end with a few lessons learned. Is a bad TMDL, I want to ask this question, is a bad TMDL as bad as no TMDL at all? I think the answer is yes. I don't think a TMDL is necessarily a solution. And I'm not trying to be too cynical or jaded just because we're not on track to meet the Bay TMDL's 2025 targets. I think if you just think about some of these questions, for example, you'll understand that a TMDL is not a panacea. What if a TMDL punts most of the pollution reduction allocations to unregulated sectors? That's something that a TMDL writer could do. What if a TMDL aggregates all stormwater loads rather than apportioning them to, say, the construction, municipal, industrial sources? That's not very helpful for a permit writer who then has to incorporate that waste load allocation into the MS4 permit. What if a TMDL under apportions loads to the MS4? What if they say we don't want to have to do much about municipal stormwater, so we're going to kick those loads to a different sector? And then even if you do have a solidly written TMDL and a waste load allocation for the MS4 permit, it's important to understand a TMDL has no end date, right? So what is a permit writer to do when they're incorporating that waste load allocation into the permit? You know, how much of that needs to be accomplished over the 5-year permit term versus subsequent permit terms? Bottom line, incorporating waste load allocations is a good start, but it is not nearly enough. So I suppose that's lesson number one. I suppose related to that, if there is solid numeric waste load allocation in the TMDL for the MS4 permit, that's great. But I want to emphasize again that that's just a starting point. That's not necessarily good enough. Why? Well, for one thing, just look at Maryland's experience. We started incorporating the ISR, the impervious surface restoration requirement, long before we had the Bay TMDL. And I would guess that there were very few TMDLs with a waste load allocation for MS4 permits back then. The state did it anyway. They went ahead and said, we got to start doing something about stormwater pollution. What they did was they issued these MS4 permits with the ISR requirement telling them to do something about their impervious surfaces, invest in stormwater management, green infrastructure. So again, it's just emphasizing that point. Don't wait for waste load allocations, numeric waste load allocations. That would be a very limited solution to the much bigger problem of stormwater pollution and everything that goes along with it. I guess another lesson or tip here would be to start fostering greater conversations with policymakers. For one thing, having state law on the books can be very helpful for protecting the permits against legal challenge. Beyond that, it's really important that New Jersey think about what it is they want to do. What is the purpose? What is the reason why they want to modernize their MS4 permits? There are so many problems associated with stormwater, as I mentioned earlier, and so many solutions, so many great solutions. They need to think about what it means for New Jersey and what it is they want to focus on most. And you don't have to pick just one thing, but is it purely TMDL achievement? You know, it's a very legalistic goal, I suppose. Are there certain streams or water bodies? You don't have a Chesapeake Bay, but I'm sure you have some other beloved water bodies. Is it climate resilience? As I mentioned, I honestly believe that Maryland's most important climate adaptation policy is their MS4 permit, because it does something about those impervious surfaces. If you want to keep New Jersey livable for the next century, if you want to keep Maryland livable for the next century, you got to do something about the increasingly severe and intense rainfall, right? Otherwise, we're just going to have catastrophic floods year after year. It's going to keep decimating our communities. We have to do something. We have to make sure that that stormwater can infiltrate somewhere safely rather than just flood through the communities. Environmental justice and toxic reduction. Every single year, the science is further developing about the impact that stormwater pollutants have and environmental justice issues caused by those, especially in vulnerable urban communities. There's a lot of economic benefits. These are local jobs that cannot be exported. It's very capital intensive, requires a lot of labor. These are green jobs. So think about what it is that New Jersey wants to accomplish with their MS4 permit and put a stamp on it with the help of your policymakers. A few other things, this is not typical of an advocate, but I would say starting slow is okay. The first permit required the phase 1 MS4 jurisdiction to map their system. You can't have an adequate impervious surface restoration policy or other effective water quality based effluent limitation if you don't know the actual footprint and infrastructure points of your MS4 system. That would be not a bad requirement for your first modernized MS4 permit. If you haven't already gotten to that point, force them to map their system thoroughly to understand the infrastructure, the catchments, where the flooding is happening, where the TMDLs are, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You got to map it. And then prioritize, as I mentioned, figure out what the priorities are, and then focus your implementation, the stormwater BMPs, focus them in those areas. If it's environmental justice, make sure that those BMPs are being put into place to protect those communities. If it's a particular stream, don't scatter the BMPs willy-nilly throughout the landscape. Maryland has done that. It has not been as effective as it could have been. Concentrate those BMPs in one area and really demonstrate proof of concept. And then finally, focus regionally. I cannot emphasize enough how different New Jersey and Maryland are in that regard. If you were to look at a map of the United States and all of the different MS4s, you're going to see a lot of tiny dots. And then in Maryland, you're going to see a giant blob. It's because the entirety of Central Maryland, Baltimore City and the 9 largest counties in Central Maryland, are all MS4 jurisdictions. And the Department of the Environment here made the determination that the MS4 regulated area is coterminous with the county or city boundaries. So the entirety of Central Maryland is all basically one large MS4, and we have a very county heavy state, right? So only a few counties, it's much easier to implement an MS4 policy than it is if you have hundreds of tiny little towns, each of which is its own MS4. So the smaller the MS4s, the more important it is that the towns are allowed to collaborate, regionalize, especially for funding reasons. Another lesson learned, I suppose, here is where the counties and cities, each county and city is different politics, different budget, different willingness to innovate with MS4 policies. You're going to find some success stories. You're also going to find a lot of obstinate local officials who don't really want to go along with this. I think you have to understand that one way to make up for, as I say, lackluster local MS4 progress is if the state is willing to do this, the state has control over its own budget. You have your own phase 1 MS4 in the highway system, and the highway system runs through the entire state. So use that highway system as a very well-funded MS4, and it can collaborate with a lot of those smaller jurisdictions. And the larger piece of the pie that the highway system becomes in solving stormwater, the better, I think. Finally, I'll just end with, I think the central problem, the central failing with Maryland's MS4 policy has not been the policy itself, it's been the enforcement of the policy. We don't have milestones in the permit. So they get to the end of the permit, it's not enforced, they slap a fine, and the fine is a tiny fraction of the overall cost of compliance with the permit terms. So there's essentially no incentive for these jurisdictions to take seriously the capital intensive and expensive endeavor of investing in stormwater management. So enforceability is key. You gotta, milestones are key. Nudge them, nudge them, nudge them. And if you have to, you have to penalize them in a manner that will actually incentivize compliance. Otherwise, it's all just a piece of paper. So I will stop there. I'm sure I went over my time. I'm happy to answer any questions later, but I understand that it is now California's turn.
Thank you very much, Evan and Sean. You have the con, so to speak.
All right, let me try to share my screen, make sure I do that successfully. I'm going to try to put it in presentation mode, but let me, is it in presentation mode, Mike?
Yes, it is.
Well, thank you for inviting me to this conference. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all today. I won't get too much into the, introducing myself again, but my name is Sean Bothwell. I'm the Executive Director for California CoastKeeper Alliance. I've been here for about 11 years now, and I've been probably the top advocate in California working on the state's stormwater permits. So I have quite a bit of experience working on California has 4 statewide stormwater permits, one for small communities, one for our freeway system, one for industrial folks, and one for construction folks. And I'm going to get into a couple of those in a second. A couple of housekeeping things, just like Evan, just like him, I'm not providing any legal advice, just sharing some experiences that we've gone through here in California. And then also, my experience is pretty California based. The federal EPA has asked me on several occasions to work with them on some federal priorities around stormwater and water recycling to a degree. So this is going to be very somewhat California focused. And the one thing I'll just warn everyone about is, given California's water supply issues, capturing stormwater for water supply is probably one of our biggest drivers besides the Clean Water Act and water quality goals we have. So while we're capturing stormwater for water supply purposes, I think the same type of lessons I'm going to go through can be applied nationwide when, as Evan spoke to about climate change and more increased flooding. The more we can capture stormwater before to put less pressure on the MS4 system and the sewer system, probably the better. So I just changed my screen. If for some reason that slide didn't change, let me know. But this is the outline I'm going to go through. I think Evan did a great job of laying a really great foundation and explaining a lot of the nuances of stormwater, which is going to be a great segue into my presentation. And what I'm going to try to do is illustrate 4 different case studies or 4 examples of California implementing TMDLs into our stormwater permits. 3 of them are our statewide permits, and then I'm going to get into the Los Angeles permit, which kind of leads the rest of the state when it comes to permitting and regulatory compliance. I do want to echo what Evan said about accountability and enforceability. He said something to the effect that it's one of the missing ingredients in the TMDL, and that's the one kind of stream and thing that connects all of these permits, and whether the implementation of the TMDLs was successful or not really comes down to, are the permits holding the regulated community accountable for their pollution? And I think what you'll see is, me as an advocate in California, we're willing to give time to come into compliance with water quality standards, but there needs to be accountability. As Evan said, there needs to be these interim milestones, and those milestones need to be enforceable along the way to keep people on track. So that's kind of the theme of what I'm going to go through today. But let me start with just a little bit of legal background. The way we see it and the way California sees it, incorporating TMDLs into MPDS permits is required. the Clean Water Act says that TMDLs need to be incorporated as waste, incorporate the waste load allocations as effluent limits into the permits. Now, whether they're numeric or narrative, that's up for debate, and we're going to get into that. But they do need to be consistent with the assumptions of the TMDL. And so that doesn't mean you can just create new standards or new requirements in the permit. They need to be in the TMDL themselves. And so that gets to the point of Evan's point earlier of it's really important to write a TMDL properly. I would agree that a bad TMDL is probably worse than any TMDL at all. In fact, in California, we're starting to move away from TMDLs just because we feel like we can go straight to the permitting process rather than build a TMDL, which takes a lot of time. If it's written poorly, it's just not going to work anyway. Let's just go straight to the permits and institute what we need to do there. So writing the permits with specifics, not blending the waste load allocation among a bunch of stormwater permittees, but being very specific, really is key when it comes to the permitting process. And I should also say, TMDLs are pretty useless unless they're actually being implemented into the permits. And California, I think, has a history of being a leader on environmental laws and regulations. But to be perfectly honest, we're really good at writing laws, and we're really terrible at implementing them. And so we got a bunch of great paper laws on the books, but we're doing a terrible job implementing them. And it really, the state seems more interested in creating off-ramps and lack of accountability rather than holding folks accountable. And so having a TMDL that's well written at the beginning will help that permit writer translate those waste load allocations into permit terms that are going to hold folks accountable. So I wanted to touch on numerics for a little bit. Evan started to get into this a little bit. But in California, we're really pushing to move more towards numeric standards rather than narrative standards. And I like to use the speed limits in police as a good analogy. If we were to set our speed limits as just drive safely, if that was the case, the police wouldn't know whether someone, it's a gray area. Are you driving safely or not? They don't know. And so that leads to lack of enforcement. And if someone a cop were to enforce, you're not driving safely, there's another gray area of it was his word against the driver, and it's a very gray area. If you were to set a limit 30 miles an hour, then the cop knows when a driver is either breaking law or in line with the law. And when they go to enforce the law, it's very clear that that law was broken. And then the driver knows. The driver knows, oh, I'm breaking the law right now, or I'm not breaking the law. I should slow down. So the same is true for numeric limits in stormwater. If the permittee doesn't know whether they're breaking the law or not, they're not going to change their activity to come into compliance. And same with our California has state and regional water boards. They're not going to do stormwater enforcement because they don't really know if you're breaking the law or not, and they don't want to get into the fight of whether they will win in court or not. And numeric limits aren't any type of new concept. You'll notice this is from 2009 guidelines. These were more focused on construction and industrial facilities, so they have to meet the BCT standard rather than what Evan was discussing, which is the maximum extent practical. But this is 11 years now that this guidance has been out there. Very few numerics are being put into permits. And again, 2010, EPA has been advocating, pushing for local permitting authorities to use numeric limits when it's feasible, because again, it holds people accountable. People know when they're exceeding standards and when they're not. So I'm going to get into the 4 case studies now, and I'm going to start with some of the better ones and then move towards some of the TMDL incorporations that aren't really working as well, and it'll hopefully elucidate some best practices, but also some lessons learned as we go through it. So the industrial stormwater permit was reissued in 2015 in California, but then revised in 2018 to incorporate our TMDLs in California. And we negotiated pretty heavily with the state and to get these TMDLs, most of them are in Los Angeles, all of our TMDLs in California from But there are a few in Orange County, which is south of LA, and San Diego, which is again further south. But these are all these TMDLs have been incorporated into the permit as numeric effluent limits. And someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is it's the first time a stormwater permit incorporated numeric limits into the permit itself. So it was somewhat controversial. It took quite a bit of negotiating. But some of these TMDLs, if you look second to the bottom, the Newport Bay Toxics TMDL, it said a waste load allocation of zero. Zero copper was allowed into the bay. So if you go back to those regulations of the waste load allocation, the assumptions need to be translated properly into the permit. It's pretty easy to argue that zero means zero and it should be translated as a zero numeric effluent limit into the permit. So we negotiated to get those TMDLs as numeric limits, but it came somewhat at a price, not a price, but maybe a compromise. If we're going to require numeric limits, then we need to provide some flexibility to permittees. And again, this is where incentivizing and pushing for stormwater capture really comes in.
So Sean,
Yeah, Mike.
Sorry, you're coming in and out sound-wise, so I don't know if you can sort of lean in just a bit more.
Sorry
about that.
I apologize. I'm actually in a hotel room, so it might be the bandwidth Wi-Fi here. Let me know if it's still a problem. I'll try to talk closer to the computer. So we negotiated three flexible options for under the industrial permit. The first is pretty simple, just meet your numeric standards. However you need to do that, whatever BMPs you need to implement, you need to meet your numeric standards in your permit. No one really wants to do that, right? And a lot of people just don't think it's even feasible. So we provided two other options. The second option is to build a stormwater capture unit on your property, capturing stormwater to the 85th percentile. And we're trying to push for a higher standard than 85th percent, but we did do some modeling, and the state did some modeling around this, and found that for the most part, 85th percentile does capture the pollutants necessary to meet the standards, the numeric standards that are in the permit. So it wasn't perfect. This is kind of where we compromised, but it captured quite a bit to the point where we were comfortable allowing that to go forward as a compliance option. And then the third option is for the industrial facility to pay into a regional stormwater project, pay the municipality, and they would take on the liability of the stormwater, but they would build a regional stormwater capture project. And that's helpful for a couple of reasons. One, the municipality, if the industrial person doesn't meet their standards, they're going to be liable as that runoff runs into their MS4 system. And two, at least in California, we have a constitutional provision that really prevents municipalities from funding, from raising a stormwater utility fee. And so this was a creative option to give funding to municipalities to help with their liability, but to also help with funding these stormwater projects. And I'll say that we are also currently working on a commercial stormwater permit. It's going to start in Los Angeles, but we're hoping it'll become a statewide permit using the state's residual designation authority, going after the large commercial parking lots. So think of like Costco or Target. And we're going to put this type of three-tiered compliance option into that approach as well. So that was the industrial permit. And I would say that's probably been one of our more successful permits because again, it holds folks accountable. They either have to meet their numeric standards, they have to build a stormwater capture, and if you build it to the 80th percentile or not, or you have to pay into the fund. So, and when you pay into that fund, the liability doesn't just go away. The liability goes to the municipality. So the second case study is one that we're actually currently working on right now, which is the construction stormwater permit. And let me see. This is the history of us actually fighting for numeric standards in the permit. The first construction permit was adopted in 1999, it had narrative standards. And then in 2006, California had a blue ribbon panel that looked at the feasibility of numerics. Again, this was focused on just construction and industrial permits. It was also it wasn't looking at water quality-based standards. It was looking at technology-based standards. So the BAT, BTC standard that industrial and construction folks had. So the idea was you needed to look at BMPs and see what numerics were feasible based on the BMP's effectiveness. But the Blue Ribbon panel found that that was something that could be determined through BMP data. So in 2009, the State Water Board adopted construction permits with numerics in them. So I guess technically these were the first with numerics in there, but they were taken out for turbidity and pH. Our construction industry sued the State Water Board and won. And ironically, they won on a similar argument that we had made. We had made the comment that you can't just pick a number out of thin air. It needs to be based on BMP effectiveness and what is really feasible with the BMPs. And instead of listening to us, we were trying to get more stringent numerics, the State Water Board just picked numbers. And so the building trades folks sued the State Water Board and said, you can't do that. You can't just pull numbers out of thin air, which is exactly what we said. And the court agreed. So they pulled out the numerics. We made the argument that they just needed to adjust them. But the State Water Board felt it was easier to just pull them out altogether. So unfortunately, we didn't have TMDL standards for pH or turbidity. We just had nothing. There wasn't even a narrative standard because they just took it out. So right now we're undergoing the reissuance of the construction permit. It's been going on since 2019. I won't get into it, but our governor is a little problematic. He's not the greatest on water issues and has actually held this permit up from public review for over a year now. It's just now starting to get some public comment and attention, but the building trades folks put some pressure on the governor, and so he held that permit for a little while. But that permit does have numerics in there. Basically what they did was they looked at what we did in the industrial permit and said the TMDL and the waste load allocation is written the exact same way for the industrial folks and the construction folks. So their effluent limits should be the same. We've already translated them for industrial. The construction folks need to meet the same standards. So that's the fight we're having now. Hopefully, right now it's more of a political issue than a legal or technical one. But we're hoping that the permit will be adopted next year with numerics similar to what's in the industrial permit. So the third study is the Los Angeles municipal study, and the next one's going to be municipal as well, because I know that's part of the attention of this panel is more municipal stormwater. I don't work on local permits, but this permit really drives the rest of the state. A lot of the permits and policies that we have come and start in Los Angeles. So I think it's an important permit to review. So Los Angeles did something fairly innovative, and they did it to encourage stormwater capture, but also, again, to shield polluters, to take away the accountability that should be provided in TMDLs. NRDC and our LA Waterkeeper brought some enforcement action against some folks in Los Angeles, and they didn't like that very much. And so they worked for several years to find a way to shield them from citizen suit enforcement going forward. And so the innovative approach that they did was, instead of a pollutant load permit, so whatever grams for metals or whatever the load was, instead of holding them accountable per load of pollutant, they're now regulated more on volume capture. So how much stormwater are you capturing rather than discharging into our waterways or our ocean? And the idea is that volume acts as a proxy. If you capture 80% of the volume, the idea is you're probably capturing 80% of the load, and therefore you're meeting water quality standards. And so these are largely driven, unfortunately, by consultants. And so what they do is it's largely based on modeling. And so they will model the MS4, the region. They will model where the water is going and what BMPs need to be put in what areas. So if you recall, Evan was saying how it's might not make sense to just scattershot BMPs everywhere. We are taking that next step where we're modeling where the most effective places to install BMPs are, to install stormwater capture are. And then that modeling hopefully will inform whether folks will be meeting water quality standards once those are built. The problem with that, though, is it takes a long time, particularly in California, to build stormwater capture, mostly because of the funding concerns we have. So the the regional board provided the municipalities with decades, 10, 20 years at some points, to come into compliance with their water quality standards because they're going to need time to build this stormwater capture. So what they did was they built into the permit that as long as the permittees have created a, they're called watershed management plans. As long as they have a plan in place to do this in the next 10 to 20 years, then they're deemed in compliance with their receiving water limits, and citizen suit enforcement is shielded. We're not allowed to bring any type of enforcement action against them. So that was problematic. The environmental community was pretty upset over that. And as you can see from here, UCLA did a study, and so far, this permit approach of implementing TMDLs is not working. It's really just an excuse to kick the can down the road. People don't have the financial capability to do this. And quite frankly, the models are based on inaccurate data. That's just not going to lead us to meeting our standards in any time soon. So I already kind of went over some of these concerns. So our two biggest problems with this approach, again, is the financial capability. If permittees cannot adopt stormwater utilities, then how are they supposed to spend the millions to billions of dollars that they estimate it will cost to capture all this stormwater to meet standards? We just don't see it happening. We would like it to happen. We work quite a bit on stormwater funding. In fact, we do more to raise funding for stormwater than, quite frankly, the permittees and the local governments do here in California, but they're still not going to meet their requirements. And then second is, as I said, these compliance plans are driven by models, and the models are driven by BMP effectiveness data. And the state did a study recently looking at BMP effectiveness data. And one, there's not a lot of data out there, and the permitted community will admit that they don't share all of their data because they don't want to be held to changing their BMPs, which I can understand. But there is a lack of data, and then the data that is out there, the error bars on whether these BMPs work or not are probably the worst thing I've ever seen. To the point where me and the regulated community were, getting a briefing on this study, and they freaked out before I did because they were so upset that they were spending millions of dollars on these stormwater capture units, and they have no idea whether they're going to lead to achieving receiving water standards in our lifetime, quite frankly. So those are the two biggest problems from the environmental community. We have been working to try to get some fixes for this approach because we do like the idea of incentivizing stormwater capture. So one of the biggest things is the State Water Board has required that the interim milestones that are within these compliance plans, that they be enforceable, and that it's not an excuse that you don't have the money to build these. You committed, the permitted community committed to this when they agreed to do these plans and get this shield from citizen enforcement. So if that's the case, if that's the approach you signed up for, you need to find the money to do it. They don't have to do these plans. They could just try to meet standards like everyone else in the state, but they have this option. If they chose to use this option, they don't get to use financial capability as an excuse. And then we are working on trying to improve BMP data. Like I said, we did the one study. We're trying to collect more BMP data now, trying to work with the permit community to release some of that data and maybe keep some of it confidential so that citizen groups or the state won't come after them for enforcement because their BMPs aren't working. So we're trying to negotiate that as we speak. And then the other really important thing is monitoring. Monitoring holds people accountable. Monitoring shows are we improving or are we not improving? And so to have required receiving water monitoring as a backstop, so whether these models and whether these stormwater capture units are actually working or not, is ultimately what's going to make this program work or not work. Because at the end of the day, you can capture a bunch of stormwater, but the Clean Water Act needs, we want our watersheds to be clean, fishable, swimmable, drinkable. And so the monitoring is really what's going to ensure that. Last case study I'll go over is what is called our Caltrans stormwater permit, but basically it's all of our freeways here in California. And it like the Los Angeles permit is a municipal stormwater permit, so they're under the MEP standard as well. And this is one where they started off actually really bad, and we're moving towards fixing some of our mistakes. So Caltrans actually has 84 TMDLs under them, and they own a lot of property. It's very linear. So, you know, they're touching on a lot of areas that have a lot of TMDLs here in California. In 2012, they incorporated the TMDLs and they tried to come up with this creative compliance unit approach. It's kind of like credit trading, but not exactly. The State Water Board did a lot of modeling and a lot of calculations to figure out how many acres of land they're responsible for cleaning up in order to meet their waste load allocations and their effluent limits. And so what they did was they looked at how many acres a unit and given them 20 years and came up with this just random number of 1,650 compliance units. And so basically every year they have to achieve this amount of compliance units. And so they either need to treat 1 acre, which equals 1 compliance unit, or they need to pay into this cooperative program. So they would basically pay the municipality to do some type of either BMP, stormwater capture, whatever the BMP implementation is, in order to start moving towards waste load achievements. Basically, over the last 8 years, the state, after us, complaining for quite a while, have came to our side of this isn't working. And again, it comes down to accountability. If the Caltrans agency only has to pay $88,000 per unit for someone else to clean up their mess, then they're never going to be held accountable and they're never going to actually get there. And what we've seen is water quality is not improving based on this program, based on this compliant unit program where they can basically pay. And they pay for the lowest hanging fruit. They're not actually going after TMDLs where they have small, more closer compliance schedules. In California, we do have compliance schedules in our TMDLs. And so they'll just go after the low hanging fruit rather than the biggest priorities and the biggest water quality problems. So what we're working on now, the state has admitted that their program does not work. And so the state's done actually a really good job of taking all the TMDLs and translating those waste load allocations into effluent limits that are specific to Caltrans. The problem though, is we've wasted 9 years now on this credit program, and they're so far behind that now 62 of their TMDLs, they're not going to meet by their compliance deadline. So apologize for the acronym. TSO stands for time schedule order. It's a type of enforcement order that's available. And basically for Caltrans is going to get 62 of these TSOs for all of the compliance schedules that they're missing. But the good news is they are translating them into they're actually numerics. I'm not going to call them numeric effluent limits. They're more like numeric targets, which sounds like the same thing, but legally in the state's mind, targets are just that. They're targets, they're not enforceable standards that have to be met. So we are pushing for a lot of those translations to become enforceable because, again, if you go back to one of the first slides, the state has translated the waste load allocation into effluent limits. And there's a number associated with them. So why they shouldn't be numerics, it kind of gets into that debate of can you hold MEP standard to a numeric standard? And so that's really what we're trying to push now here in California. And so that's all I have. Happy to answer any questions. Again, hopefully I teased out some of the, what works and what doesn't. I think, again, at the end of the day, the TMDL needs to be written correctly. And the more specific it can be, associating waste load allocations, allocating them to specific parties is certainly more helpful, and the clearer it is, the better. But really when it comes down to accountability, if you want your TMDL implementation to be effective, there needs to be accountability. And that doesn't mean you can't provide flexibility, doesn't mean you can't have other options for them to meet compliance, but they need to be held accountable at the end of the day, no matter how much time you give them, have interim milestones and make those be enforceable. And at the end of the day, they need to meet their standards, or else enforcement actions need to be available. And the easiest way to do that is through numerics, or at the very least, some very clear, specific targets that we know whether the discharger is meeting them or not meeting them. So happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Sean. And I'm going to open it up to questions, but I'm going to ask the first one. So, Sean, there's a target date for meeting the TMDLs. Is that in the TMDL itself, or the implementation plan, or in some other mechanism?
It's in the TMDL itself. In fact, I don't even think we incorporate them necessarily into the permit. I don't think we need to necessarily. Those can get extended though. And if you look at the Los Angeles context, one of the things that they're working to fix with that Los Angeles permit is to, rather than keep giving compliance extensions, which is what the regional boards have been doing, the state just came down with an order that says, rather than give just blanket extensions, you need to give extensions through these time schedule orders. And, you know, we don't love time schedule orders, obviously, but we recognize them as a enforcement tool. They do provide more specifics. And if you're missing the milestones in a TSO, those then become enforceable. So it's definitely helpful to, if you have to give extensions through TSOs rather than extending the deadline through the TMDL itself.
All right. And I do have a question here. So Andrew, do you want to, I'm going to bring Andrew up live and he can ask his question. So I think this might be applicable in California, but.
Sure. So in New Jersey, there's a law against unfunded mandates, and I'm wondering if either Maryland or California has this problem. It sounds like Maryland does not, but maybe California does.
California definitely does. And so that's probably our biggest fight right now. And that's kind of where, when it comes to us trying to get numerics into a municipal permit, that's probably going to be a large battle that we're going to have. The municipalities for 6 years now, I guess, have had an active strategic campaign to keep claiming that these stormwater permits are unfunded. And so I didn't get really into it, but we passed rather than do a trash TMDL, there was individual trash TMDLs in California. We did one, you know, how I said that we were moving away from TMDLs in California, rather than do one statewide trash TMDL, because the state said basically all of our waterways are impaired for trash. They did just a trash a policy. It's technically an amendment to our statewide basin plan. But in there, it requires different approaches to addressing trash. And to date, none of those provisions have been put into our stormwater permits because of this exact issue, that everything's being fought as an unfunded mandate. So it really has been a back and forth between the state and the municipalities about trying to figure that out. I think the state is moving forward now. They feel comfortable, but they did lose quite a few cases. I'll admit they were getting beat pretty bad. It got so bad where no one was reissuing new permits. California was seriously thinking about giving back its water quality program back to the EPA because it just couldn't do these permits. It also was thinking about, they said it's half jokingly, but I love the idea. Our permits in California have gone so complicated. There's 600, 800 pages now. I think I'm a pretty expert on stormwater stuff. I don't understand what's in all the permits. So how in the world, particularly like industrial facilities, they can't understand what's in their stormwater permit. And the reason it's done so big is because the state's trying to provide all this flexibility and these compliance off ramps for a regulated community. But so we've been really pushing, let's simplify these permits. And we've been going there where it's like, let's just do a 2-page permit. You know, the MEP stuff, the requirements, basic requirements of the Clean Water Act, and then at the end, meet receiving water limitations, because that is something that they have to do in California. And then on the back, and this was our state water board joking, good luck with citizen suit enforcement, like, and that's it. And you know, they were joking and simplifying it, but honestly, we want a permit that's just very simple, that says just meet standards. I don't care how you do it. Like, come up with whatever approach you want, but you better meet standards or else we're going to enforce against you. And so I think, you know, that 3-tiered industrial permit that I talked about, that seems to be the way we might be going. I talked about this commercial permit. They're pretty excited about this commercial permit because they think that might be the new kind of approach where it's very simple. Here's your 3 options, figure out how to do it, and, you know, show us that you're meeting standards through water quality standards. So that's kind of where we're at right now. But yes, unfunded mandates have been a big problem over the last 5 years for us.
Thanks.
Evan, talking about sort of the Chesapeake Bay missing the targets of 2025. Can you give us sort of, is it because the targets were too optimistic? Was it because there wasn't enough enforcement, or a plethora of issues?
Yeah, it's a plethora of issues. I mean, the elephant in the room is Pennsylvania. Some of you may have read in the papers that Maryland and Virginia are suing Pennsylvania well, suing EPA, frankly, because of the lack of progress in Pennsylvania and EPA's refusal to push them along. So Pennsylvania is the elephant in the room. A lot of it has to do with agricultural pollution, which is really not, I guess, the scope of this particular session. But it's not exactly fair to blame Pennsylvania, because if 80, 90%, I'm just pulling that number out of the hat, but if a large percentage of their pollution comes from agriculture and agriculture is not regulated, they were already set up to fail. Whereas in Maryland and Virginia, and especially DC, think about the difference between DC and Pennsylvania. Almost all of the pollution that flows into the Bay watershed from DC comes from regulated point sources. So all of their pollution is enforceable, whereas almost all of Pennsylvania's is not. So you could, again, like I said earlier, in an extreme hypothetical, you could wring every ounce of pollution out of Pennsylvania's wastewater sector. They're not meeting their Bay TMDL allocation unless and until they come up with an effective program to deal with agricultural pollution. So that's the big reason. I would say enforcement had a lot to do with it. EPA took 4 years off during the Trump years, didn't do anything. And even prior to that, nobody was really taking seriously. They came out with this pair of memos from both headquarters and Region 3 EPA in 2009 and 2010. Basically said, if y'all don't meet your your watershed implementation plan commitments, here's all the things we're going to do to you to keep you on track. They didn't do any of those things. No matter how far off track the states got, they took almost no action. So yeah, enforceability was a big problem. I think that seems to be the common theme here in Sean and my presentation is accountability and the lack thereof can really set things up for failure. There's some good looking permits out there, but if they're not enforced, what good do they do?
Great. Yeah, thank you. When I say I was jealous of the Chesapeake Bay TMDL, what I was really meaning was the hopeful actual implementation of it, which we don't have here. Does Virginia and Maryland have a good agricultural component to their problem? Or is that
on a relative basis, yes. Relative to a lot of other states, from my understanding, yes. We have in Maryland, for example, fairly strict nutrient management plan laws that are enforceable. We have robust manure transport program to make sure that the manure is going from places where it's oversaturated to places where they might actually need the fertilizer. There's a lot of money, agricultural cost share program. So on a relative basis, yes. Are they doing enough? Obviously not, because they're not meeting their target. CAFOs have proliferated. So even if the management practices are working, just the sheer input of manure and ammonia overwhelms any progress from BMP implementation and MP enforcement. So it's not perfect on a relative basis. It's stronger than most states.
Great, thank you. Well, I'm going to leave it open for just another minute or so. We're at time for anyone else who may have a question. I'd like to leave it up. But in the meantime, Evan, Sean, thank you very, very much for your expertise and your time. I learned a lot, and I'm hoping we can take some of this into our DEP when the next round of MS4 permits come out. So again, thank you very much. I'm not seeing any more questions, so I'm going to close it. We are recording. We will be sending out a recording of the program to all of the registrants, so they can come back and watch it. And again, Evan, Sean, thank you. Have a great day. And